this is session 3 on arms control. If I put the title of this session in either of or format, as some of the other sessions, perhaps it would be arms control or arms race. We have 4 distinguished speakers. I will not waste time by making a detailed introduction, since the bios are in your program book, as you all know. Let me just mention the name and their affiliation of each panelist. From my left, Mr. Abe Nobuyasu, a senior fellow with a project on managing the Atom, Harvard Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And Mr. Alexander Gabuev, is that the right way to pronounce it?
That's correct.
Okay. Senior fellow and chair of Russia in the Asia Pacific program, Carnegie Moscow Center. And Dr. Park Jiyoung, is that the right way to pronounce it? Okay, good. Senior fellow, Center for Science and Technology, the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. And the last but not least, Dr. Nicolas Regaud, is that the right way? You know, all those names are hard for me to pronounce. Nicolas Regaud, Special Representative to the Indo-Pacific, Director General for International Relations and Strategy, French Ministry of Defense. The purpose of this session is to assess the risks of arms buildup, both nuclear and conventional, in the region, and its impact on the regional balance, regional strategic balance. One of the most significant change since the last year may be the US decision to withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. It is a bilateral treaty by nature between the United States and Russia, and the Russian violation of the treaty obligation is the reason that the United States government cited for their decision. But it is no secret that there's also a China factor. In other words, the United States' strategic need to counter China's arms buildup in the Asia-Pacific was another reason. One of the US government officials said that, reportedly said that China's ability to work outside the INF Treaty had worried policymakers in DC long before Trump came into office. The US countermeasure seems to be either find ways to bring China into the treaty or develop new American military capabilities to counter it. New deployment of land-based cruise missiles and ballistic missiles in the Western Pacific, including Japan, is already being discussed. Russia is also reportedly has started development and production of new intermediate range land-based missiles. And Russia also succeeded in developing a hypersonic glide vehicle that is looked at as one of the emerging weapon systems. Just to look at these aspects of change in kinetic weapon systems makes us realize how volatile the regional military balance is, not to mention non-kinetic ones, including cyber or AI, weaponization of AI or outer space. The guiding questions that were given by the organizer are following 4. 1, are we entering a new arms race? 2, what are the implications of the US withdrawal from the INF for Northeast Asia? 3, will new multilateral arms control regimes involving China emerge? 4, and final, what are the implications of the Inter-Korean military agreement signed on September 19th last year for South Korea's arms buildup? I will ask each panelist to make initial remarks for about 10 minutes, and then we go into question and answer or discussion. Our panelists, as you see, represent Japan, Russia, ROK, and France. But as one of the guiding questions indicate, China is also an integral element in this discussion of this topic. And we're lucky to have among the audience General Yao Yunju, Senior Advisor, Academy of Military Science, PLA, with us. She is a premier expert on China's nuclear strategy. I believe it would benefit all of us to listen to China's view. Exercising my prerogative as a moderator, I will ask General Yao to make a brief comment immediately after we go into the question and answer part of the session. Then, so let us start the presentation by the panelists in the alphabetical order. So Mr. Abe first, please.
Thank you.
I will respond to the questions raised in that order. First, are we entering a new arms race? My answer is yes, we are already in a new arms race in Asia-Pacific region. There are new players. It's not only US and Russia. We now have China in the game. India is also there. Pakistan there. North Korea with its nuclear weapons are also entering the race. Iran potentially may come into the play as well. So we now have a bipolar competition situation, no, multipolar competitive situation, different from the bipolar competition during the Cold War. And also there are new elements in the arms race. Not only the nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, we now have weapons in space. We also have cyber weapons. We have hypersonic weapons. There are a variety of them. And also we have artificial intelligence being introduced to weaponry systems or warfare. Also, high precision weapons have been there for some time, but they are getting improved day by day. One significant consequence of new arms race here is that we are seeing blurring of the border between nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons. Traditionally, nuclear weapons are so powerful, huge destructive power. Conventional weapons meant just tanks, cannons, warships, destroyers. They are far less in destructive power in comparison to the nuclear weapons. But today, with the introduction of those new factors, space, cyber, hypersonic, artificial intelligence, high precision, which sometimes threaten nuclear weapon systems. And also, they may have as destructive or closely destructive force as nuclear weapons. So the borders of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons systems are getting blurred or getting close to each other. Consequently, one consequence of that is that Russia, for example, declared several years ago that against major cyber attacks, Russia may resort to nuclear retaliation. American new nuclear posture review mentions strategic attack on their infrastructure may be countered with the nuclear retaliation. So, in terms of nuclear operational plans, the borders are already becoming blurred. What are the implications of the US withdrawal from the INF for Northeast Asia? That was the second question. If the INF goes out and the US is no longer bound by the treaty, that means US will be allowed to station ground-based intermediate nuclear forces, missiles in Northeast Asia. Where will they be deployed? Potentially South Korea, Japan, Guam, Australia, or the Philippines, the ally of the United States. Perhaps in most of those cases, there will be issue of local political acceptance. We had an experience of South Korea having difficulty deploying American THAAD missiles. Japan has a very complicated situation. It has what is called 3 non-nuclear principles, under which Japan pledged not to station nuclear weapons on the Japanese soil. Well, intermediate nuclear force, INF, means not only nuclear-tipped missiles, but also it includes non-nuclear missiles as well. So there will be complication. in a future time, Americans may propose to station intermediate ballistic missiles in Japan, saying they're not necessarily nuclear tipped, so it doesn't go against the Japanese three non-nuclear principles. But they may say it's a dual use, can be used for nuclear warheads or non-nuclear warheads. That would still can ignite Japanese local resistance, which are still very much anti-nuclear. The rising threat of China can be theoretically met even with an INF, with the airborne or seaborne missiles. They don't have to be land-based. So I have not quite understood some of the voices in the Pentagon that they need to have get out of INF treaty to meet the rising Chinese challenge. I don't know. There may be certain advantage for land-based missiles. They are available 24 hours, 7 days, in comparison to shipborne ones, which have to come back to the port from time to time and have to be maintained. So I'm not very technically savvy about this. This will be inviting rather risky situation in Northeast Asia because of the competition with the blurred border between nuclear and non-nuclear. So in a future time, when some hypersonic weapons come flying to your direction, you never know it is nuclear tipped or conventionally tipped, and you never know how to react against it. So that would raise the risk of inadvertent start of nuclear confrontation with miscalculation. Third question is, will new multilateral arms control regime involving China emerge? I will say this is desirable, but rather difficult to materialize because it is an asymmetric situation. US has predominantly long-range missiles, ballistic missiles. China has more numerous intermediate or short-range ballistic missiles. So it's not easy to balance them. Also, China has a separate concern about the US missile defense system, which may, they fear, that neutralize some of their offensive missiles. US also has its own self-imposed restriction on as far as missile defense is concerned. At the time of the ratification of the New START Treaty in 2010, there was a commitment made that US will not accept any constraints on the missile defense, which may foreclose any possibility of some arrangements with China or even with Russia. So that is a constraint. But I would say it's not impossible. It may be difficult, more complicated, but a long time ago in history, there was such thing called Washington Naval Treaty in 1930s. Japan, US, UK, France, Italy joined the conference in Washington. Miraculously, it was agreed on less than 1 year. And they came up with the conclusion that US, UK would be allowed to have construction of warship, battleships, the big ones, 5 and 5. Japan, 3. Japan was placed in an inferior position. This may also, you may think about China coming into control. China has a lot fewer nuclear warheads today. Therefore, Americans, Russians will say, no, no, we cannot be accepting parity with China. So they may say, okay, 5-2, 5-3. Will China be able to accept such an inferior position? I think with the rising strength of China, people in China will not agree to it. And also, the history tells in Japan, that treaty left strong grievance in the Japanese Navy and also Japanese military. In a way, that contributed to the overthrow of civilian government in Japan by the military, one of the contributing factors. So, writing such a disadvantage into any document firmly may not be advisable. So one idea may be for China to say, voluntarily, we're not going to seek parity with the United States. That may help. That may help further reduction of American and Russian arsenals. So that's something to be thought about. It's also, it's not very much well known, but the Washington Treaty not only dealt with battleships, it also dealt with the cruisers and aircraft carriers. So it's a precedent of a treaty handling with a variety of weapon systems. The last question was implications of the inter-Korean military agreement signed on September 19th last year. I would say I'm not expert on this Korean situation, so I leave it to Dr. Park, this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abe. Then next, Mr. Gabuev, please.
Thank you so much. And I will try to bring the Russian angles, and it's very much tied to the INF. The first good news is that the title of this panel, the arms control regime, is already irrelevant. So as we say in Russia, the patient is more dead than he's alive. So the arms control is largely out of the window with INF. And the people in Russia assume that the START treaty might be next. And the reality for this is very, very, very likely. And I think that the collapse of INF and surrounding treaties, and there were a couple of treaties before that, is one of the major takeaways of the recent breakdown in US-Russia relationship that will have global consequences and that Asia really needs to be following and be aware of, because that really is important for the situation here. The reasons for collapse of the regime are multiple, and I think that the arms control regime was really a product of a Cold War with unique parity, at least in military realm of the competition between the two superpowers, mutual respect between the two superpowers, and the fear of mutual annihilation born out of the Caribbean nuclear crisis. I think that all of these three elements are gone now. There is no parity between Russia and the US, particularly Russia and US with its allies whatsoever. There is zero mutual respect on both sides. And I don't think that people are that much afraid of a nuclear calamity, particularly if you listen carefully to what President Putin says, that if anybody dares to attack Russia, we will go down in flames and we'll go directly to heaven, while everybody will go to hell, because we will die as martyrs. That's not the language that a responsible policymaker and a leader of a nuclear superpower usually uses. So that sends a lot of kind of blurred signals, and if you are in interaction with the Russians, there's a lot of kind of very mixed signals that you have. So you can feel that the acute sense of vulnerability and perishability of the human life is already starting to go away. I don't think that the return to arms control regimes with its verification mechanism is feasible for a number of reasons. I think that Russia has adopted a new approach where it doesn't seek parity with the US. It's impossible. It seeks minimum sufficient asymmetrical deterrence mechanisms. Since the US had walked away from the Missile Defense Treaty in 2002, Russia realizes that this is the real threat for the Russian strategic nuclear force going forward, and that's where development of all these new programs that President Putin paraded 2 years ago in his national address started, actually. So Russia really doesn't buy into the theory anymore that arms control regimes are the pillars for stability in the relationship with the US. That's why, assumably, the Russian violation is alleged, but I don't think that European partners would subscribe to pressurizing Russia without the US providing enough evidence. So I would believe that Russia has violated the treaty and developed a system prohibited by the treaty. So I think that Russians knew precisely what they're doing and had all of these consequences calculated. The upside for Russia is that Trump administration, by voluntarily walking out of the treaty, gave the Kremlin major PR victory for nothing. So I think that Russia is ready and okay to live without the arms control regime, and that's the situation where Russia is kind of happy and okay. It's probably not very happy, but it's okay to live with that. On the US side, it's very hard to tell what's going on, but listening to colleagues in DC, you see one towering figure in this conversation, and that's John Bolton with his huge hammer, who is trying to destroy many multiple agreements which he believes are not very favorable for US national security. And arms control regime belong to that bunch of the agreements that he's happy to throw away. Talking to Russian diplomats, they say, hey, even if we are seeking for some rooms of accommodation or at least START treaty, we don't see a negotiating partner in DC. So people are pretty pessimistic on that. With China, I think Russia tried to bring China into this agreement a couple of times and start a discussion, whereas China's position was always, it's kind of very important arrangement within the US and former USSR and now Russia as the two largest nuclear superpowers. They should continue. It's of paramount importance. Why China? Why not India too and others? And I think that just looking for the way China communicated after US walked away and Trump and Bolton hinted that if China goes to the negotiation table, the INF treaty might be revived. I see, frankly, zero chance of China in taking part of this discussion. And that's the reality. So the treaty is dead. The treaty-based system of our control is dead. What is new in this regard is, I think that has already been mentioned, the introduction of the new types of weapons, cyber with its relation to nuclear, AI-powered space-based systems. That's one. B, it's the profound return of great power competition, reaching a new stage. And these are military contradictions bleeding into political contradictions and vice versa. And then the third element is decrease in mutual understanding and desire to listen to each other and platforms for dialogue. I think that China-US visa issue is one good example where we stop talking to each other and stop listening to each other. US-Russia visa issues, which is less publicized but is also ongoing, is also there. And even if people get granted visas to access Russia, people in the Kremlin, in the MFA, in the Russian National Security Council decline meetings to American scholars. Same is happening in the US. Everybody is oh so afraid of meddling or Russian spy operations and vice versa that normal channels of communications are breaking down, and that increases the risks. Where that leads in the Northeast Asian context, I think that the first stage is really, the arms race is on, but it's going to be on very similar to the European missile crisis in the 1980s with introduction of Pershings to Europe. Problem with that is that we probably will see two camps. I totally agree with all the political problems of basing the land-based intermediate range systems in one of the US allies that might cause a lot of concerns. But what Russia and China will start working on jointly are the systems to counter that, so missile defense systems. We have seen that in 2 rounds of tabletop exercise that they have conducted on joint ballistic missile defense system, or informing each other how joint ballistic defense missile system works. They might be a live firing exercise maybe this year, maybe next year. I've heard military people talking about this, to develop joint protocols. And I think that what's underappreciated in the American discourse is how much the senior Chinese political leadership understanding of the missile defense systems, including that, is influenced by Vladimir Putin and by the Kremlin's narrative. And I think that Vladimir Putin's narrative is a very compelling one. He would say, hey, Comrade Xi, you don't have experience with this. I have. I have talked to Americans for nearly 2 decades about missile defense systems. And here is all the many offers that I made to them. I offered them to use my infrastructure. I offered them to create joint control and command centers. So there were many options on the table, and all the time they said yes and proceeded with our installations, and the installations are on. So no matter what the Americans promise to you, they're going to cheat you, and their only aim is to buy time and proceed with the global system of missile defense, which will evolve over time, get more technologically superior, and will nullify your strategic deterrent. So we should do something about it, and the best way is to do something jointly. How about buying some more S-400s and whatever, right? So that's a very compelling narrative that Russia is trying to sell, and I think it's pretty successful in doing so. So my last point would be that it's a realistic prospect. We don't have an arrangement, neither bilateral nor multilateral, for arms control or strategic stability to fall back on and say, oh, that's a safety network that's going to reduce the risks. And I think that these conversations, even on technical level, experts between various countries, is unfortunately not sufficient. And I think that Sandy Vershbow raised that yesterday in his questions to the first panel. The big question is where to put this kind of track 2 or track 1.5 conversation. Is it ASEAN Regional Forum? We all know how efficient ASEAN centrality mechanisms can be, right? Is it the East Asia Summit? Should there be something similar to 6-party talks without tying up to hopeless North Korea nuclear crisis? But I think that's something similar what we at Carnegie do with regard to cybersecurity. There is an initiative supported by G20 talking about financial data integrity. And that's a conversation between financial ministers of G20 supported by policy experts on how to agree on protocols not to attack each other, critical financial infrastructure, including stock exchange and the payment system in a time of military escalation. So some similar, very much technical level conversation, I think, is badly needed in that regard, and we need to think where to anchor it institutionally. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Dr. Park?
Okay, thank you. The Northeast Asian region is a battlefield for our new arms race. Even without the missiles, the air in the Northeast Asia is crowded by the stealth aircraft. ROK purchased 40 F-35 from the United States, and we are considering to purchase 20 more. Japan got 42 F-35 stealth aircraft, and as far as I know, they are considering to buy 105 more. And Australia got 72, and they are planning to build up around 100. And also, China developed its own invisible aircraft, J-20, and they began to produce it from 2017. And the performance is a little bit lower than the American-produced stealth aircraft, but it has an advantages of a lower cost, and I think they have some mass production ability. So China may build up 100 or 200 invisible aircraft in this region. Also, Russia is developing Su-57, 56, and it will have some high performance and invisibility. And also, Japan wants to develop its own invisible aircraft, and South Korea also is developing those kind of aircraft. So in a few years, we may see around 400 invisible aircraft in this region, and for that, there will be another competition because we cannot really see the invisible flight, so there will be another competition for technology development to see or detect those kind of aircraft. So there will be a lot of technology development, and lots of fundings for developing those technology will be happening in this area. And if we talk about the INF withdrawal of the US side, the United States already announced that there will be more new missile tests. And if there is a test, then they have to deploy it in somewhere in the world. And Northeast Asia would be the best location for the United States because China is the major competitor for the United States. And I've never heard about the real discussion of the deployment of the new missiles, but it's a very plausible to be, we think that it will be deployed in the near region. So it's obvious that United States and China is doing the arms race right now. United States put large budget into nuclear maintenance and modernization currently, and there is a need for new arms control architecture because current arms control regime like INF is collapsing, and the New START program, we are a little bit doubt about it, and the major nuclear arms control, nuclear non-proliferation treaty is not very effective because of the North Korea. So there is a need for the new framework or new regime, but as Ambassador Abe told that it is not a very easy thing to do. And China still have much less nuclear arms than the United States, but China is continuously building up the nuclear arsenals. Because of this asymmetry, China focuses on destructive military technology and prefers local conflicts or the contingency rather than full-scale war. And the artificial intelligence development and the introduction to the military technology can make a shift of this power balancing between the United States and China, because China is heavily focused on this artificial intelligence, high energy military technologies, and robots, or the space technologies, or cyber technologies. So arms race between the two countries will lead faster technology development in this field as far as China's economy allows those competitions. One little bright thing from this arms race or arms competition is sometime later, the human being will be benefited from this technology, because lots of technology we currently use is from the military technologies. So it's a little bit of bright side of the arms race. Well, we cannot leave out North Korea because North Korea is a major player in the Northeast Asian region for arms race. North Korea's possession of nuclear weapon adds complexity to the calculation of arms race in Northeast Asian region. North Korea challenges the United States. For over 3 decades, there were lots of negotiations and lots of talkings about the denuclearization for the North Korea. And there was 9 major UN sanctions imposed to North Korea, but still they do not give up the nuclear program. And after 6 nuclear tests in 2017, and the development of a missile technology of North Korea does not give room to US to ignore North Korean nuclear program or have some strategic patience toward North Korea. So United States have to do something to stop the nuclear program of North Korea. But in the other hand, in the meantime, North Korea's nuclear position as justification for the United States for their presence and building up of their own defensive system in this region. And China also does not agree with North Korea's nuclear status, but China needs to embrace North Korea at a certain point. China officially supports denuclearization and opposed to North Korea's nuclear position. But In the meantime, China's main goal is to reduce U.S. presence in this region. And by any means, current nuclear situation of North Korea working toward arms race rather than arms reduction. Under these circumstances, South Korea chose to make some peace movement. South Korea's sixth peace plan in Korean Peninsula, and last year, September 19th, South Korea tried to visualize the peace effort through the border arms control. The September 19th Inter-Korean military agreement is an important step toward peaceful Korea and should lead to arms reduction for both parties. This agreement is for the trust building between the parties, and it should provide a more peaceful environment for this Korean peninsula. Major purpose of this agreement is to prevent military confrontation near the border, and it has three major inclusions in the agreement. First one is it established a buffer zone near the military demarcation line. The buffer zone stretches to 5 kilometers from the line, and inside the 5 kilometers, there should be the guard post should be evacuated from the area, and there would be no exercise in the buffer zone, and also the joint security area should be demilitarized. It was the first condition. And the second inclusion was about we are setting the no-fly zone. The no-fly zone is from the military demarcation line, it's 20 kilometers to the both sides, and at the sea, it's to 40 kilometers from the northern limit lines. So inside those the no-fly zone, there would be no-fly. It's include unmanned vehicles also. And the third one is there should be some joint military commissions between South and North, and it's not being implemented yet. And after the agreement said, the ROK military clarified that South Korea will closely coordinate with the international community in implementing the agreement, and the agreement will not constrain any defensive measures for ROK, and the agreement has been set on the full acknowledgement of the northern limit line because there was some concerns about the northern limit line. This announcement was because of the rising concern about this implementation and impact of the agreement. And even though the agreement was an outcome of Korean government's effort to confidence building with North Korea, others criticized that it is too early to move on, and it might lead disadvantages toward asymmetrical threat from North Korea. And the major concern was a surveillance problem for the ROK because of the no-fly zone around the demarcation line. However, in fact, on the contrary of the effort of arms reduction between two parties, South Korea is building up its military system. We are purchasing more of made in USA arms, like aircraft and the defense systems like that. Every time President Moon met President Trump, we put some money on the defensive systems and arms. So in the facilitating talks between United States and North Korea, we are building up the arms systems. And North Korea seems to be pulled back after Hanoi summit. So the arrangement between North and South military agreement, it's by no means any real arms reduction right now. But the major point, and I believe that we have to appreciate the effort of South Korean governments to develop confidence building between the two. And under these circumstances that world is beginning to its arms race, and we have unchanged and imminent nuclear threat from North Korea, then what should be the South Korea's choice for the arms race or arms reduction? Well, I will stop here and I will leave it to the discussion session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Park. And Dr. Regaud, please.
Yes, thank you. So I'm very well aware that this panel seeks to widen the issue of arms control in Asia to include conventional weapons. However, in the context of increasing rivalry competition between major powers and crumbling international arms control architectures, I find it hard to figure out what might be the prospect for arms control agreement in Asia. So I do agree with what the previous panelists have said. So I decided to first to consider that as this conference is about Korea, all right? And secondly, that the most important element in terms of arms control is preserving the NPT and the non-proliferation international architectures. I decided to propose you a different perspective and to focus my remarks on the most acute and urgent arms control issue, which is a North Korean nuclear crisis. So I'll attempt to briefly answer three questions. First, what does Europe and France in particular feel very directly concerned by this crisis? Secondly, what is their political stance and how do they contribute to the management of the crisis? I think this question is not sufficiently well known in the region. And thirdly, what are the specific challenges borne by the potential arms control agreement concerning North Korea? So firstly, why do we feel concerned? France, as a permanent member of the UNSC, holds special responsibilities for international security and contributed as such to successive UN Security Council resolutions imposed on North Korea to stop its nuclear and ballistic programs. The fact that France is also a member of the UNC Military Armistice Commission since its creation adds an element of political interest regarding security in the Korean Peninsula. But beyond these historical, diplomatic, and political reasons, there is no doubt that eminently strategic reasons explain France's specific engagement, notably within the European framework, within which it played a driving role on this issue. As a matter of fact, North Korean nuclear and ballistic programs have made considerable progress over the last years, to the point that Pyongyang's ability to pose a threat beyond the regional framework and up to the European continent must now be considered as credible. It is a major development that, even without any political manifestation of an hostile intention by Pyongyang towards Europe, must be taken into account in a strategic way, that is to say, based on capacities and not on statements or intentions. In addition, secondary proliferation activities conducted by Pyongyang, notably to the benefit of Middle Eastern countries, constitute an enduring matter of concern. Through this crisis, the future of the NPT and that of the regional alliances forged by the US, which provide the basis for strategic stability in Eastern Asia, are also at stake. And should this crisis lead through successive stages to this double weakening and pave the way for other proliferation crises, the security of the world will be affected, and in particular that of Europe, considering the nearby countries that are most likely to be tempted to proliferate. Therefore, contrary to what some people still believe, the Korean nuclear crisis is not just a regional crisis. It affects the foundation of the international non-proliferation architectures and impact, as such, directly Europe's security. So what to do? This strategic analysis leads us to take a stand and to act to the utmost of our means at the diplomatic and military levels. As a matter of fact, it is still in the interest of the Europeans today to contribute to a strict implementation of the sanction regime decided by UNSC, which the EU transposed in introducing additional measures. It is the main way, in our opinion, to nudge Pyongyang into seriously reconsidering its strategic choices. For, despite Singapore and Hanoi summits, the North Korean behavior gives reason to doubt that the regime has made the critical choice of complete denuclearization, and its programs continue to be carried out. This also means that we must contribute as far as possible to the fight against the bypassing of international sanctions, especially those on energy. This notably means for France and the United Kingdom taking part in the air and sea activities carried out to fight against North Korean sanction-busting operation through air-sea surveillance, as well as information coordination and sharing activities, which prevented some illegal operations. Lastly, as proposed by President Macron during President Moon's state visits in October last year, France is willing to provide all its technical expertise in disarmament, which is based on a recognized national and international experience, if a genuinely negotiation process on a complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization is initiated. At last, I would like to make some remarks on arms control in the North Korean nuclear crisis if an agreement takes place. The first challenge is that of mutual trust. We have good reason for mistrusting a regime that so often failed to abide by its commitments and international obligations, and whose cultures of secrecy is hardly compatible with openness, dialogue, and transparency. On the other hand, how can one fail to understand that Pyongyang, for its part, find also hard to trust major powers when they violate the Memorandum of Budapest or toss aside an international agreement like the JCPOA. Therefore, even after the Singapore and Hanoi summits, the central question remains whether the Pyongyang regime is prepared to change its strategic calculation and to genuinely turn to the path of denuclearization. To encourage it, we must continue along the path laid down by USNC and exert maximum pressure on North Korea, and for this to succeed, the traditional economic partners of this country, especially China and Russia, must take full part in this process. This pressure must, however, go hand in hand with an open and respectful dialogue between Washington and Pyongyang, as well as between the two Koreas, to name but the main countries. The fact that Kim Jong-un focused on lifting the sanctions during the Hanoi summit shows that despite numerous sanction-busting operations, these sanctions do hurt and hinder the North Korean ambitions to be able to reconcile regime stability, nuclear status quo, and economic development. It is therefore an essential leverage that we should retain as long as North Korea did not fully turn to the path of denuclearization. This also confirmed the strategy whereby no deal is better than a bad deal. And a bad deal would be one that, first, would weaken alliances, secondly, would not apply to all the components of a nuclear capability, especially its delivery systems, and thirdly, whose verification mechanisms would have a lower standard than those of the non-proliferation treaties and conventions such as the NPT and the IAEA, Additional Protocol, or the CWC. This is a fundamental dimension of every arms control of disarmament agreement, and France demonstrated during the negotiation with Iran that it was extremely vigilant about that. It is a domain in which every concession, every lack of vigilance may be paid at a high price and lead to jeopardize the very principle of a complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. The tug of war will continue, but it is crucial that it continues without escalation or backtracking. You see the path promoted by France and Europe, as President Moon observed it during its European tour. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Having heard 4 presentations, I think it's fair to say that a pretty bleak and somber picture has been presented. And so, as a moderator, I'll ask just 2 quick questions to the panelists and move on to General Yao. The first question is, the impact of this kind of bleak prospect of multilateral arms control regime on the negotiation with North Korea denuclearization. Apparently, I don't think it's going to help for this negotiation of North Korea denuclearization when the rest of the region is going into new arms race. And I was wondering how you see that impact, and if there's any way to minimize that negative impact, I'd like to hear it. And the second question is, then what are we going to do? Mr. Abe said that new multilateral arms control is not possible, but no immediate prospect. And Mr. Gabuev said, right, sorry, he proposed track 2 or one-track technical dialogue. I think that's in order to at least share the risk assessment or situational awareness to find a way forward. But if any of the panelists have any specific steps for the future, I also like to hear. Anybody or in any order, just raise your hand and then please.
That's the degree of the sovereignty or realism of this panel.
Okay, in this order. Please.
The prospect of multilateral arms control in the region, including China, is not very good. And looking back into the history, think about the time when the INF Treaty came into existence. There was a very strong opposition, demonstrations, sit-ins in Western Europe against deployment of the Pershing II missiles. Against that background, even the conservative President Ronald Reagan was obliged to negotiate seriously with the Soviet Union. And that brought finally the treaty. Today, there's no such strong public opinion either in the United States, in Japan, South Korea, anywhere, asking to stop arms race. So there's no sort of pressure from behind to push the politicians to engage in serious negotiations. And in fact, even though Trump administration has kept open the opportunity for arms control agreements when they announced INF withdrawal, it doesn't seem to me that they are eager to pursue negotiations to come up with a new arms control treaty. So with that sort of a situation, it's not very easy to foresee.
So, Mr. Gabuev, anything a little bit more than track 2 or track 1 point dialogue for technical
I would
things?
unfortunately agree with Abe-san. I think that if you try to relate it to yesterday's panel on historic memory and reconciliation, which I found fascinating, one of the elements which was missing in the discussion is that you need to spill a lot of blood to feel the pressure to reconcile.
Right.
And unfortunately, we are not in the moment that the politicians or the decision makers feel that it's oh so dangerous that we need to stop and jump on the negotiation table. And it used to be oh so much easier with the 20th century physics and just 2 superpowers. It's now so asymmetric and so much fused that it's really very hard to envision any legal framework for that. So I think that if we start a meaningful conversation on the technicalities and just to be on one page on the technical issues surrounding this, and then really not to try to dump the communication lines between the capitals, that would be sufficient for me as an initial step.
Don't be too ambitious, right?
Be realistic. And then on the North Korea issues, I think that we are stuck anyway because the different sides completely are misaligned on the end game. I don't think that Russia and China, though paying lip service to complete verifiable and irreversible denuclearization, believe in it for a second. And unless we really agree on point B or where we are going, how can we agree on negotiation techniques vis-a-vis North Korea? It's just hopeless. So I think that we should separate this broader conversation about arms race and missiles and missile defense in the region from the North Korean issues, and they shouldn't be interlinked.
Dr. Park, impact on North Korea denuclearization, what do you think?
Well, one sure thing is that if North Korea is denuclearized, then the arms race in this region will be reduced. But the vice versa, if the arms reduction happens in this region, then the North Korean nuclear problem will be solved. I don't think so, because the arms race should have some partners or competitors to make escalations. But for North Korea, China is not the competitor. Russia is not a competitor. And we thought, South Korean, we thought that the main competitor to North Korea was us, South Korean. But suddenly they take the competitor as a United States. So nobody thinks that they are rivals and they can make some arms reduction treaty or anything else. So it should be separated, and well, the arms race or arms reduction is between the superpowers, and North Korea is the other things. It should be separated. Yeah.
Dr. Regaud?
Well, not on the consequences on North Korea, but just a remark on the difficulty in Asia to have countries agreeing on any kind of a convention or arms control agreement. Take the example of the Arms Trade Treaty, which was negotiated some years ago and agreed on 5 years ago, something like that. The US, China, Russia, India, and others refused to sign it. And then, of course, most of the Asian countries refused also to enter into this agreement, which is not really compelling, which is politically engaging, but there is no mechanisms to verify or to control what the countries are exporting themselves. So it is something quite a light engagement for them. And in Asia, you have just Japan, South Korea, I think, who have agreed to this arms trade treaty. So it gives you a smell of the difficulty for having them engaged in more serious and compelling engagements on the number or on defense system themselves.
Now, General Yeo Yunju, advisor of Academy of Military Science, PLA. to present the Chinese view. Can you give her a
Do
microphone?
we have a mic?
So China is a big factor in this panel, and actually China needs a seat on the platform.
I didn't make this.
So, very briefly, I have a relatively long comment and
Please,
one
go ahead.
specific question. I will say focus on China's position on the INF Treaty withdrawal of the United States. China is not officially a factor in the U.S. decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty. The official reason, justification, is the Russian violation of the treaty itself. And China was not a factor in the original agreement back in 1987, when the two superpowers reached the INF Treaty. So China was not the original reason. China is not yet the official justification. And so I don't see any reason for China to shoulder the responsibility of the failure of this treaty. First point. My second point is that China is opposed to the US withdrawal from the INF Treaty because it is one of the most important pillars of the global arms control and disarmament regime, and it is also a very important element of global strategic stability. So now there are several things has already gone, like the ABM treaty, the Iran nuclear deal is in danger, and now INF and New START treaty, the extension of the New START treaty is also a question. So as a player in the international community, China is for these regimes to be in place. It's not good for China. And also this, the gun of the withdrawal of the INF Treaty, the failure of the INF Treaty would cause arms control mainly in Europe, because it was a transatlantic but not trans-Pacific treaty originally. And the space, the range is from 500 kilometers to 5,500 kilometers. The range from East Russia to the Western European, the most Western European borders. So it's about the confrontation in Europe back in the Cold War. And so I don't think it's fair for China to take the responsibility to save this treaty. And then the asymmetries that Mr. Abe just mentioned, I agree with you. Two speakers used asymmetries. I like it, because that is the word I use to explain China's position. China, considering arms control calculations, the INF, if we use the INF framework, then China's security concerns are totally different from the security concerns of Soviet Union or Russia or United States and European countries. China's security concerns are periphery. It's not yet global So the missile strike capability, intermediate missile strike capability from 500 up to 5,500 kilometers are very important for China. China has 14 bordering neighbors. And if these missiles are has nuclear capability, then China has to deter not only the United States, but Russia, sorry to say that, theoretically, India, North Korea, nuclear capability concerned. Pakistan, and maybe in the future, Iran, who knows? Sure. So this is all within the China's security concern. And also the intermediate strike capability, the force posture is asymmetric. China has a greater majority of this kind of capability are land-based missiles and cruise missiles. And China does not have a lot of air-based or sea-based intermediate strategic strike capabilities. So to include China in NF treaty and to ask China to give up 80 to 90, 70 to 90% of his missile strike capability for nothing, for 0% of equivalent capabilities from United States and Russia. Is it possible? Is it fair? So that's another reason why China cannot be included. But China is not all, I don't think China will be so negative about arms control negotiations if all the relevant countries like India, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea, Russia, United States were included, and the intermediate strike capability like air-based, sea-based, submarine-based are all included, then China would be willing to talk. Is it possible? But I don't know. So that's my explanation of China's position on the NF treaty. Is China very concerned about the failure of this treaty? I don't know. I think that it will be politically difficult for the United States to deploy land-based cruise and ballistic missiles in East Asia countries like Japan, South Korea, or the Philippines. And it would be not very economic for the United States to have land-based capabilities now that it has other capabilities which can almost satisfy the military requirement. So it's not feasible and not necessary. So my question to my Japanese and maybe South Korean colleagues, is it possible for Japan and ROK as allies of the United States to host the land-based cruise and ballistic missiles on your territory?
Okay, let's answer this question and then I'll make the floor open. Mr. Abe, what do you think?
A couple of comments I wish to make. A symmetric situation indeed is more difficult to have arms control. But suppose you take a picture of each country. This country has 1,000 long range. this country has 500 mid-range. They agreed to shrink everyone the same ratio. That's one idea. So it's not impossible. I was also engaged in trade negotiations a long time ago. They had also tax reduction exercise called harmonization. Those who have a bigger number will reduce by big percentage. Those who have smaller percentage will reduce just slightly. And that way they can somehow come closer, but still maintain the difference. So there are many ideas. You can be creative. Or minimum thing, the US, China, other countries may be able to do, short of arms control agreement, may be to agree to identify which missiles are nuclear tipped and which missiles are not. That way you can avoid miscalculation. For example, today, you never know this cruise missile carries a nuclear warhead or not. And if it's coming to you, local commander may have to assume it has a nuclear warhead, therefore has to quickly retaliate. That raises the risk of escalation. By mutually notifying that these ones don't have nuclear warheads, you can avoid that sort of situation. So that's kind of minimum confidence building measure. That may be possible.
But her question was, would Japan accept the deployment of intermediate range missiles?
It would not be easy. And for any Japanese administration to take that task would be difficult. And Americans may come to conclusion it's too big a political price to pay to deploy land-based in Japan. Instead, you can deploy airborne or seaborne. So it's up to the future decision, I think.
Dr. Park, how about ROK?
Well, I think it's a very low probability that we can host the land-based missile system of the United States, because we even not included in the United States missile defense system. But, well, things always change and situations change, so I'm not for sure.
Okay, the floor is open. Dr. Pollack.
Thank you to all the panelists. All of you have revealed, shall we say, the difficulties of moving from a very notional idea about some kind of arms limitation process and realities, but to try to clarify what some of the problems are, I've identified you're dealing with three very, very different issues that have been talked about in this panel. The first are issues pertaining to strategic arms control, specifically going back, of course, to the negotiated agreements between the United States and the former Soviet Union that, at least according to the United States, led to the withdrawal from the INF Treaty. That's got a logic of its own simply because of the scale and scope and numbers of those missile capabilities, although the argument is that China ultimately ought to become involved in the process, but I understand the reasons that Yao Yunju has noted. That's number one. Number two is not an arms control issue, it's a disarmament issue, and that's the question of North Korean capabilities. To be very frank, North Korea would be thrilled to have an arms control process. That would legitimate the weapons that it has. They identify this very, very specifically. And the third issue are the dynamics and military buildups among US allies, the purposes of which are not entirely clear to me. Indeed, and this is my question to Park Jiyoung, you let the cat out of the bag, as we say in the United States. You alluded to the fact that these large-scale air asset capabilities have been a direct function of pleasing the President of the United States. That suggests to me, and I'm not arguing that as significant powers, Japan and South Korea do not have reasons of their own for pursuing weapons acquisition, but is this an arms race or is it something else? that reflects the curious dynamics that we now have in the world in which we live. Thank you.
Next gentleman over there.
Thank you. Kęstutis Paulauskas, NATO staff. Very interesting panel, but also somewhat depressing, I have to say. A quick comment and then a question on INF treaty. It's official, it's not dead yet, but it's on the way to the morgue, arriving in August. On the comment by Alexander that it was seen as a PR coup by Putin. The thing is that for US, they did not take it lightly, and they took the decision in close consultation with all NATO allies and with the allied support. The problem was that the three options they had were equally bad. They had option to stay in the treaty and accept violation, which would mean everyone is racing except the US. Stay in the treaty, but develop the capability and violate it. Not a feasible one. And third option was, of course, to withdraw. And it was seen probably as the least bad option of the three. My question is, Ambassador Abe mentioned the new domains, cyber, space, artificial intelligence, and Ms. Park also alluded to the dual nature of these domains, civil, military. Missile technology is lethal capability. These domains are dual use. Do you see any prospect for any sort of code of conduct, rules of behavior that would perhaps be born in the civil society that would help alleviate the risk of unintended escalation and misperceptions in these highly destabilizing technologies? Thank you.
Okay, one more question from the gentleman, and then go back to the panelists. Right? Okay,
Thank you very much, Chair. Brooke Smith-Windsor with RAND Corporation. It's a follow-on, really, to my NATO colleague here, particularly with respect to AI. And I'm just very interested in the panel's view as to the prospects for success of the UN group of governmental experts on laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems, that, as you know, was established in 2016, first met in 2017, now under the chairmanship of North Macedonia. I believe all your countries have participated in the meetings to date, the last round, of course, in March of this year. Just wondering, in the context of this multilateral forum, this effort to try to move forwards, that some semblance of agreement on controls on laws, what's your feeling? As has been stated, it's been very pessimistic, the general tone, but this perhaps is at least a baby step in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, from Mr. Abe in order. Whichever question you would like to answer.
Yes, number of points. First of all, yes, indeed, we have discussed many issues, and for example, long-range ballistic missiles. Chinese concern is missile defense. That may devalue the value of the long-range offensive missiles. Well, one idea to solve this dilemma is to introduce a new counting rule. If the US has, say, 100 missile defense interceptors, let's count 2 as one offensive missile. So by balancing Russia and US, for example, if US is allowed to have 1,500, but has 100 interceptors, US will be able to have only 1,450. That way you can balance. So Chinese concern may be taken care of in that sort of counting rules. Code of conduct, I think the UN has a group of government experts working on it. I think they're also working on automatic intelligence and automatic weapons. I think they're also working on cyber as well. So hopefully they may come up with some idea to put the regulations. And for example, I'm basically law student. For example, in the cyber case, require applying international law at the time of war. Any military operation or hardware has to have a flag, right? So ask anybody who conducts cyber attacks to carry the flag of your country. But this accountability is the most difficult thing about cyber. So they say, it's impossible. But let me think that way. And according to the international law, if it doesn't carry a flag, any country is allowed to destroy, right? That's like pirates. So you may think about it.
Mr. Gabuev?
On PR effects, I think that I would agree with you. The problem was the way that has been communicated to the allies and the evidence presented by the US side, like the timing of presentation of the evidence and the time allowed for people to digest. And then B is setting the deadline for the talks with the Russian side themselves. It's basically you dismantle the missile in like how many weeks? Like there were 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then otherwise we walk away. I don't think that looked very well. So setting a realistic deadline and addressing the Russian concerns, which I think more kind of artificial, on Aegis Ashore, on the target missile for missile defense system, and on drones, which technically, like if you really read into the INF, they fall into the agreement, though it's clear for everybody that they're not missiles. So you could try to find some resolution to this, right? And then probably address the genuine Russian concern where they say, hey, these are land-based systems, but you have so much superiority in aerial, in naval-based system. How do we try to equalize that given participation of China? So it's a very different world. How do we adjust the treaty? If that process would be exhausted in a year, I think it would look much nicer than the way it looked when Trump just walked out. And what I hear again, Mr. Bolton's role in this process couldn't be exaggerated. On UN panel of experts, I think that we're in the stage where neither of the countries really wants to put any limits because we are very early on in the stage of the race, and that everybody believes that they have a competitive advantage, and the followers are just so miles and years behind you that they need to reach a critical stage, and you will be like miles ahead of them. So I think that's why Russia and China are, like China I think is somewhat more diplomatic and soft, but Russians say there is nothing there, there is no need to put any cap or to discuss this. So I think that that's going to stay. Because you may say that Russia is technologically unsophisticated, but if there is one area of AI which is developing rapidly, that's the military use, and Russia is pouring a lot of money on this. And then on corporate setting the standards, that's a very lovely idea. How about talking AI standards and 5G standards with Huawei? Or Kaspersky? I mean, please. Dr. Park.
Thank you. I didn't mean that the Korean defensive system or military buildup is due to the conversation between the presidents. We set the numbers of our weapon systems and how many planes we should have and what kind of defensive systems we should have. In calculating those kind of things, we compare the Chinese military buildups and the Japanese military buildups. But it doesn't mean that we want to race with them. We want to just calculate that what is the minimum military capabilities to defend ourselves. So under those calculations and under those plans, maybe the conversation between the two presidents adds a little bit more of the margins or timing when we plan to have some more the defensive system in maybe 2025, then it can shorten by 2023 or something like that. A little bit of our margins. And of course, there's some choice that we can make if we introduce the made in United States, made in USA weapons, or made in the France weapons, or maybe we can develop our own weapon systems. So there's a little bit of a room to negotiating or make some changes. But originally, it's our own plan, and it doesn't unnecessarily expand it.
Dr. Regaud.
Yes, maybe a couple of remarks on arms race. that's an old question. What is arms race in Asia? Is there any arms race in Asia? If you have in mind the military spendings, most of Asian countries are spending less than 2% of their GDP. So compared to the Cold War period, you can consider that it's quite reasonable. And but in certain area there is a problem. Maybe in the naval area, in particular, when you see that China is the tonnage of vessels which are commissioned every 4 years. Every 4 years, it represents the French Navy. Every 4 years, 300,000 tons of new vessels are commissioned by the Chinese Navy, which represent the French Navy. So, I mean, there is a movement of modernization, in particular in China, and now competing with the rate of modernization of the American Navy, and which is something new, something which is moving the lines, unbalancing the situation. But as my colleagues have said, it is particularly in the field of asymmetric capabilities that that new movements emerging, and that nobody wants to enter into a capping of their capabilities. Everybody considers that as competitive advantages. So these are capabilities which are have the possibility to fill the gaps in terms of military power. So that's the kind of magic weapons that everybody wants to have in order to rebalance the situation. And in that domain, I doubt myself that we can have any code of conduct or arms control agreements. And I remember what my minister said when she was visiting Washington some weeks ago. She said that as for NATO, the clause of solidarity is Article 5 and not Article F-35. It was a way to recall that sometimes, sometimes it happens that Washington is putting a lot of pressure for having their equipment instead of recognizing that, well, the question is, of course, spending more for collective security, but respecting sovereignty of anyone.
I got 2 more minutes, and if you have a burning quick question, I can entertain one. Okay, that's it. That lady in the back, please. That's the last question.
I wanted to ask about something that maybe you've mentioned, but I haven't really picked up on it, which is what we like to call the military-industrial complex. So I was sort of missing in discussion. We've talked a lot about arms control in terms of limiting country stockpiles of weapons, but what about arms control in terms of private sector sales? So if I remember CIPRI data, I think there's been a continuous growth of arms sales. I think it was 2.5%, 2016, 2019. And I think also US is around 57% of the top 100 arms sales in 2018. I think it was last year's data. So my question is, the private sector, what role did it play, does it play in the collapse of the arms control regimes that you've mentioned? And what do you see, what role can it play, will it play in the future for maybe reestablishing regimes or even further collapse of the ones that exist? Thank you.
I make it voluntary. Whoever wants to answer, please, raise your hand.
You want to deny business people their legitimate profits? And deny thousands of people their legitimate jobs?
Well,
yes, please.
Japan has long maintained arms export ban policy. It's been modified recently, but still Japan so far has not succeeded in exporting anything, any weapons system abroad. So in a way, it has a self-restraint. Also, recently, one of the major banks in Japan decided not to invest in sort of military industry. So that sort of exercise on the private side is being done.
Well, time is up, and we didn't, of course, didn't come up with the answers, but at least we share the kind of awareness, situational awareness where things stand. And let me join me in thanking 4 panelists for making a tremendous presentation. And thank you very much. That's it.